The 13th of February 1945, 9:47 p.m., Flight Lieutenant James Patterson sat in the cockpit of his Lancaster bomber at 18,000 feet above Dresden, Germany. Through the plexiglass, he could see the city below transformed into something that didn't look real. It looked like a vision of hell rendered in orange and red. The firestorm was already raging from the first wave of bombers. His bombardier was counting down to the drop point. In 30 seconds, Patterson would release his payload of incendiary bombs into that inferno. And in that moment, watching the flames consume an entire city, something broke inside him. He released the bombs because orders were orders. But Patterson would later tell military psychiatrists that he knew, absolutely knew, that what he was doing that night was wrong. Not strategically wrong, morally wrong. He would fly 12 more missions before the war ended, but he never forgot Dresden, and he wasn't alone. You see, the bombing of Dresden wasn't just another raid in the strategic bombing campaign. It was the moment when significant numbers of Allied aircrews began questioning whether they were liberators or whether they had become something else entirely. The moment when the clear moral distinction between Allied and Axis began to blur in ways that haunted men for the rest of their lives. To understand what happened in those cockpits over Dresden, you need to understand what these men had been doing for years. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany was based on a theory that civilian morale could be broken through sustained aerial bombardment. Target factories, target infrastructure, and yes, target civilian populations to destroy the enemy's will to fight. By February 1945, this campaign had been running for over 3 years. Thousands of sorties, hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs. Entire cities reduced to rubble: Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, Essen. The list went on and on. The aircrews who flew these missions were volunteers. Every single one had chosen to join Bomber Command or the US 8th Air Force. They believed they were fighting necessary war against an evil regime. They had seen what the Nazis did. They knew about the concentration camps, the genocide, the aggression that started the war. If bombing German cities helped end the war faster and saved Allied lives, then it was justified. That was the logic. That was what let them sleep at night. But Dresden was different, and the difference wasn't immediately obvious in the briefing rooms on the 13th of February when crews received their orders. Dresden was described as a major transportation hub and industrial center, a legitimate military target. The city was filled with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army, but that wasn't emphasized in the briefings. What was emphasized was that Dresden's rail yards were crucial for German military movements, and that destroying them would aid the Soviet offensive. The first wave of British bombers arrived over Dresden at 10:15 p.m. on the 13th of February, 244 Lancaster bombers carrying a mix of high explosive and incendiary bombs. The weather was perfect, clear skies and good visibility. The German defences were minimal. Dresden hadn't been heavily bombed before, and most of its anti-aircraft guns had been moved to defend other cities. The Pathfinder aircraft marked the target zone with flares, and the bombers began their runs. Wing Commander Maurice Smith led one of the bomber streams that night. He had flown 47 missions. He was experienced, professional, and believed absolutely in the necessity of strategic bombing. But years later, he would describe the Dresden raid as the moment he began having doubts. Not that night, not immediately, but in the days and weeks after, when the reports came in about what had happened on the ground. The bombing created a firestorm. This wasn't an accident or an unexpected result. It was the intended outcome. The mix of high explosives and incendiaries was designed specifically to create firestorms. The high explosives would blow out windows and expose flammable materials. The incendiaries would ignite thousands of individual fires. Those fires would merge and create a self-sustaining storm that would consume everything in a several square mile area. The physics of firestorms are terrifying. The intense heat creates an updraft that pulls in surrounding air at ground level. This creates winds of 100 miles per h-hour or more toward the fire. The temperature at the center reaches 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing survives. Buildings collapse. Asphalt streets catch fire. People caught in the firestorm are killed by carbon monoxide poisoning, by heat that sears their lungs, or by the simple lack of oxygen as the fire consumes all available air. The second wave of British bombers arrived 3 hours later. Faye Lancasters, their job was to bomb the same target area, to hit rescue workers and firefighters, to ensure maximum destruction. By this time, the firestorm was fully developed. Crews could see the glow of Dresden from Faye miles away. As they approached, the visual was unlike anything most of them had ever seen. Flight Sergeant Robert Adams was a bomb aimer in the second wave. His job was to look through the bomb site, identify the target markers, and release the bombs at the precise moment for maximum accuracy. He had done this dozens of times over other German cities, but Dresden was different. In his post-war memoir, Adams described what he saw. The entire city was one massive fire. You could see individual streets as channels of flame, buildings were exploding from the heat, and you could see tiny dots moving in the streets below trying to escape. Those dots were people, thousands of people, and we were about to drop more incendiaries on them. Adams released the bombs, he followed orders, but he wrote later that he vomited in his oxygen mask immediately after. His pilot had to help him breathe and get the mask cleaned out before they suffocated. Adams flew 6 more missions before the war ended. Then he resigned his commission the day after Germany surrendered. He never spoke about Dresden publicly until Faye. Years later, the third wave came the next morning. American B-Faye bombers, Faye aircraft. Their target was the rail yards, or so the orders said, but the rail yards were in the center of a burning city. The smoke was so thick that many bombardiers couldn't see their targets and dropped their bombs based on radar readings, or simply dropped them into the general area of the fires. Captain Michael Morrison flew a B-Fane in that third wave. He was a patriot, believed in the mission, believed that defeating Nazi Germany justified harsh measures. But when he returned to base and attended the debriefing, something changed. The intelligence officers were congratulating the crews on a successful mission. Estimates suggested massive destruction of German infrastructure and significant disruption of military movements. All true technically, but then one of the intelligence officers mentioned casually that reconnaissance photos suggested civilian casualties might be substantial because of the refugee population in the city. Might be substantial. That phrase stuck with Morrison. Years later, he would tell his family that was the moment he understood what he had participated in. Not disrupting military movements, not destroying infrastructure, killing refugees, women and children fleeing the Soviet advance, non-combatants who had nothing to do with the Nazi regime's decisions. Morrison completed his tour of duty. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service, but he never wore the medal. It stayed in a drawer until his death in Faye. His family found it with a note attached. "I don't deserve this for Dresden." The scale of what happened at Dresden became clear in the days following the raid. Initial German reports claimed Faye dead. This was propaganda, an exaggeration meant to portray Allied brutality. But the actual death toll was horrific enough. Modern historical research suggests approximately Faye people died in the Dresden raids. Faye in one night, most of them civilians. Most of them burned to death or suffocated in the firestorm. For context, that is more than died in the entire London Blitz, more than died in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, in a single raid on a city that had minimal strategic value in February Faye, when Germany was clearly defeated and the war was effectively over. The controversy began almost immediately. The Associated Press correspondent in Paris, Robert Reed, filed a report describing the Dresden raid as a terror bombing designed to break German morale rather than destroy military targets. The story was published, then quickly retracted under pressure from military censors. But it had been seen. Questions were being asked. Churchill himself, who had been a strong advocate of strategic bombing, suddenly distanced himself from the Dresden raid. In a memo dated March, Churchill wrote, "It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing of German cities, simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed." He was criticized for this apparent reversal, and the memo was withdrawn, but the damage was done. Even at the highest levels, people were having second thoughts. For the aircrews, the psychological impact was complex and often delayed. During the war, most convinced themselves they were following orders, doing their duty, helping end the war faster. The Nazis were evil. Germany had started the war. Germany had bombed British cities first. These rationalizations worked for most men most of the time, but Dresden cracked those rationalizations for significant numbers of aircrews. Why? Several factors made Dresden different from previous raids. First, the timing. This was February. Germany was clearly defeated. The Soviets were miles from Berlin. The Western Allies were across the Rhine. The war would be over in 3 months. The strategic justification for raids that killed tens of thousands of civilians became much harder to maintain when victory was obviously assured. Second, the target. Dresden was known as Florence on the Elbe, a cultural centre famous for its Baroque architecture and art museums. It wasn't a major industrial city like Essen or an obvious military target like Hamburg's shipyards. Attacking Dresden felt gratuitous in ways that attacking clearly military targets didn't. Third, the refugees. Dresden's population had swollen from to over 1 million because of refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. Everyone knew this. The intelligence briefings mentioned it. The crews knew they would be bombing a city filled with displaced civilians. Fourth, the results. Previous raids had caused massive destruction, certainly. But the Dresden firestorm was visible from incredible distances. Crews could see what they had created in ways that weren't possible with other raids. The visual impact of an entire city burning created an emotional response that abstract casualty statistics didn't. The psychological toll manifested in various ways. Some men broke immediately. Sergeant David Hughes, a wireless operator on a Lancaster, requested immediate relief from flight duties after the Dresden mission. He told his commanding officer he could not in good conscience participate in any more raids. This was essentially a form of conscientious objection, which could lead to court-martial. Hughes was sent for psychiatric evaluation. The military psychiatrist diagnosed him with acute anxiety reaction and removed him from flight status. But Hughes later stated the diagnosis was a face-saving measure. He wasn't having an anxiety reaction, he had made a moral decision. Most men didn't break immediately. They continued flying missions because that is what you did. You didn't quit, you didn't let your crew down. But the doubts began growing. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Clark flew more missions after Dresden before the war ended. He seemed fine, received his discharge, returned to civilian life. But Clark began having nightmares in 2 years after the war ended. Dreams about fires, about burning cities, about people trying to escape flames. The nightmares continued for decades. Clark eventually sought therapy in 5 years after Dresden. He told his therapist that he had spent those 5 years trying not to think about what he had done, but the memories wouldn't stay buried. The therapy helped somewhat, but Clark told his family before his death that he never fully escaped Dresden. The city he had helped destroy remained with him always. The crew dynamics after Dresden were often strained. Bomber crews were tight-knit units. They depended on each other for survival. They bonded through shared danger, but Dresden created rifts in some crews. Some men defended the raid as necessary. Others began questioning not just Dresden, but the entire strategic bombing campaign. These arguments could get heated, breaking friendships that had survived dozens of combat missions. Navigator Paul Foster and his pilot, Captain Richard Hayes, had flown together for 18 months. They had completed 52 missions as a team. They were close friends after Dresden. Foster began expressing doubts about strategic bombing. Hayes, who believed strongly in the necessity of defeating Germany by any means necessary, defended the raids. The arguments escalated. By the time the war ended, Foster and Hayes weren't speaking. They never reconciled. Foster attended Hayes's funeral in 1971, but didn't speak to Hayes's family. The Dresden argument had destroyed a friendship that had survived everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. The official military response to dissent about Dresden was to suppress it. Men who expressed doubts too vocally were removed from flight status, sent for psychiatric evaluation, or simply transferred to other units. The military couldn't afford to have bomber crews questioning their missions. Morale was critical. Doubt was contagious. If significant numbers of airmen began refusing to fly, the entire strategic bombing campaign could collapse. But the doubt existed nonetheless. Post-war surveys of bomber crews, conducted decades later by military historians, revealed that Dresden was the single most controversial mission of the European bombing campaign, more controversial than the Hamburg firestorm that killed 40,000, more controversial than the Berlin raids. Dresden stood out as the raid that most frequently caused crews to question what they had done. Some men found ways to rationalize Dresden even after the war. They focused on the legitimate military targets in the city. They emphasized that Germany had started the war and bombed Allied cities first. They argued that anything that shortened the war, even by days, saved lives overall. These rationalizations allowed them to live with what they had done. Other men never found peace with Dresden. They believed they had participated in something fundamentally wrong. Not illegal, the raid was conducted under lawful orders, but morally wrong, a crime against humanity even if committed against a Nazi enemy. These men carried guilt for the rest of their lives. The most tragic cases were the men who broke completely. Sergeant William Thompson flew on the Dresden raid as a tail gunner. He completed his tour of duty, returned home to Scotland, and seemed to adjust well to civilian life. He got married, had children, worked as a schoolteacher. By all external measures, he was fine. But in 1958, 13 years after Dresden, Thompson committed suicide. He left a note for his wife. In it, he described recurring dreams about Dresden, about seeing the city burn, about knowing he had killed innocent people. The note ended with, "I can't carry this anymore. I am sorry." Thompson's case wasn't unique. The correlation between Dresden participation and post-war psychological trauma was significant enough that military medical researchers noted it in studies of combat stress. Dresden veterans showed higher rates of PTSD symptoms, depression, substance abuse, and suicide than veterans of other bombing missions. The numbers weren't overwhelming. Most Dresden veterans lived normal lives, but the correlation was real and measurable. The moral questions raised by Dresden extended beyond individual aircrews. The entire doctrine of strategic bombing came under scrutiny after the war. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted in Fay examined whether strategic bombing had been effective. The conclusions were mixed. Bombing had damaged German industrial capacity and disrupted transportation, but it had not broken civilian morale, which was the primary theoretical justification for targeting cities. German civilians had endured horrific bombing and continued supporting the war effort, or at least not actively opposing it. The theory that you could bomb a population into submission had been tested thoroughly and had failed. This meant that raids like Dresden, which were justified primarily as morale-breaking operations, had been based on flawed assumptions. They had killed tens of thousands without achieving their stated strategic objectives. This realization was devastating for some aircrews. They had accepted civilian casualties as necessary collateral damage in pursuit of strategic objectives, but if those strategic objectives were never achievable through bombing, then the casualties weren't collateral damage. They were just casualties, people killed for nothing. The Dresden controversy continues to this day. Historians debate the military necessity of the raid, the accuracy of casualty figures, and whether it constituted a war crime. These debates are important for understanding the history and ethics of strategic bombing. But for the men who flew the mission, the debates were irrelevant. They knew what they had seen, they knew what they had done, and for many of them, no historical analysis could change the fundamental reality of their experience. February Fay was the day Allied pilots bombed Dresden. For most of them, it was another mission in a long campaign. They did their duty, followed orders, and went home. But for some, Dresden was the day something broke, the day they looked down and saw not a military target, but a city of people burning alive, the day they realized that victory could be achieved through methods that were morally indistinguishable from the crimes of the enemy they were fighting. Some of those men never flew again. Others flew but carried Dresden with them for the rest of their lives. Because that night over Germany, they learned that you can follow orders, you can fight for a just cause, you can be on the right side of history, and still do something unforgivable. That was the lesson of Dresden, and it is a lesson that some men spent the rest of their lives trying to forget, but never could.